They say the past never dies, it just hides in the walls, in the spaces between old photographs, in the things families refuse to speak about. But in a small American town, one girl's childhood began as an innocent story, and ended as something that still stains the land she grew up on. Her name was Eleanor, a quiet child with pale skin and wide grey eyes that never quite looked at you directly. The neighbors said she was polite, well-mannered, the kind of child who'd curtsy to strangers and thank them for their time. And beside her, always, was the man she called Father. He was known simply as Mr. Avery, a stern, deliberate man who rarely smiled but never raised his voice. The kind of presence that filled a room not with warmth, but with gravity. He kept his home in order, his yard trimmed, his curtains closed. Every morning the townsfolk would see him walking Eleanor to the bus stop, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, and every evening she'd return home with that same small, rehearsed smile, the one that never reached her eyes. For years, no one questioned it. They just assumed it was one of those quiet homes where silence meant safety. But there were things, small things, that didn't add up. The way Eleanor flinched when someone mentioned her mother, the way Mr. Avery referred to her not as my daughter, but as the girl. When she turned 14, the church choir stopped seeing her on Sundays, the grocery clerk stopped recognizing her face, and by the following spring she was gone. Mr. Avery told anyone who asked that she'd been sent to live with relatives out west. He said it with such ease, such finality, that people nodded and let it go. But 30 years later, when the Avery property was being torn down to make room for new development, a construction worker unearthed something that shouldn't have been there, a lockbox wrapped in rotting canvas, sealed tight beneath the basement floor. Inside were photographs, faded, warped by moisture, and a birth certificate that didn't match any name the town had ever known. And just like that, the story that had been buried for decades began to breathe again. They say truth has a scent, faint at first, like damp wood or old dust, and once you notice it, you can't unsmell it. When the lockbox was opened, that scent filled the air. What the men found inside wasn't just paper and photos, it was the outline of a life that had never existed, at least not the way people thought it did. The birth certificate bore the name Eleanor Grace Whitlock, not Avery. The date of birth matched the girl everyone remembered, but the signature at the bottom, the father's name, was not Mr. Avery's. It was a name no one in town recognized, Samuel Whitlock. Next to it, written in faded blue ink, was a mother's name, Margaret Avery. The men didn't think much of it at first. Maybe Eleanor had been adopted, maybe Avery had remarried, but when they brought the box to the county office, the clerk who handled vital records turned pale. There was no record of a Samuel Whitlock ever living in the county or anywhere in the state. No census, no tax trail, no obituary. It was as if the name had been invented, a placeholder for someone who was never meant to be found. The old sheriff, who had been a rookie back when Eleanor vanished, came forward quietly. He remembered something odd about the Avery property, a locked shed behind the orchard, always guarded by dogs, always smelling faintly of bleach. He remembered the mother too, Margaret, before she disappeared. A woman of fragile health and hollow cheeks, who once confessed to a neighbor that she didn't sleep well at night because the house wasn't hers anymore. When the sheriff revisited the property after the discovery, he found that same shed, collapsed and half swallowed by the earth. Inside, buried beneath years of rot, was a rusted bed frame chained to the floor. Beside it, a single porcelain doll with its eyes scratched out. The forensics team would later say the wood was stained, that the chains had been used often, that someone, perhaps for years, had been kept there. But no bones were found, only hair, blonde, fine, and childlike. The county sealed the site, and the headlines tried to make sense of it. Mystery at the Avery farm, they called it, but those who'd lived through that era knew better. They remembered how Eleanor never quite looked like her father. How she'd called him that word with hesitation, as if it had been taught to her, not felt. The truth, it seemed, was clawing its way up from beneath the soil, piece by piece. When the first journalist arrived in town, the locals barely spoke. They'd learned long ago that silence was safer than curiosity, but a few old voices began to crack under the weight of what they'd kept inside. One woman, Miss Harlow, who used to teach at the local school, remembered Eleanor vividly. She said the girl never joined in playground games, never laughed when the others did. Instead, she'd stand by the fence, eyes fixed toward the tree line that bordered her family's land. It was like she was waiting for something, Miss Harlow whispered. Or someone. The journalist followed that thread, digging through old records that hadn't been touched in decades. What he found was worse than forgotten. It had been erased. There were photographs of Mr. Avery before Eleanor was born, but beside him, in one of them, was another child. A boy. His name scrawled on the back was Samuel, the same name that appeared on Eleanor's birth certificate. But this boy had Avery's face. The jawline, the cold eyes, the same crooked smile that made people uneasy without knowing why. According to hospital archives, that boy had died in 1932 at the age of 16. The cause of death, pneumonia. But there was no grave, no obituary, no funeral notice, just a paper trail that ended abruptly, like someone had decided the story was over. The journalist tracked down a former nurse from that same hospital, now in her 80s, living in a care home 2 counties away. She remembered the Averys too. She remembered the night Margaret was admitted, crying and delirious, with bruises up her arms and a fractured wrist. She was pregnant. The nurse said Margaret refused to say who the father was, only that he wouldn't let her leave. 9 months later, Eleanor was born, and the man who signed the certificate wasn't the child's real father, but her brother. That truth didn't fit neatly into the headlines. It didn't make sense to the reporters or the neighbors. How could a town so small, so ordinary, hide something so monstrous in plain sight? But the ones who had lived there, who had watched the Avery house from a distance, knew it wasn't about monsters. It was about control, about a man who believed blood was his to shape, his to own, and about a girl who grew up calling him father because she was never told there was any other word for him. When the news spread, the town split in two. Some refused to believe it, called it gossip, slander, the work of outsiders trying to soil a good man's name. Others, quieter, said they'd always felt something was wrong but didn't dare to say it aloud. The Avery house had always seemed to watch the town rather than live in it, and now people realized it had been watching for a reason. As investigators combed through what was left of the property, they uncovered more than just the shed. In the attic, beneath a loose floorboard, they found a collection of notebooks, Mr. Avery's handwriting, dated over 15 years. The entries were short, clipped, meticulous. He wrote about discipline, about purity of blood, and about the child as continuation. There were phrases underlined again and again. My legacy will not be broken. In one notebook, dated the year Eleanor vanished, a single page was torn nearly through the middle. What remained was written in trembling ink. She knows. Experts later analyzed the writing and noted a shift in tone. What began as religious conviction became something darker, almost delusional. Avery believed he'd been chosen, that his family's bloodline was unpolluted and must remain that way. He saw Margaret not as his wife, but as his vessel, and when she resisted, he turned to Eleanor, the child born of his own sin, as his next vessel of redemption. The story fractured anyone who touched it. Reporters abandoned the investigation midway through, citing sleepless nights and a feeling of being followed. The sheriff's notes from that time are erratic. Whole sentences scribbled out, one line reading only. There are sounds beneath the foundation. When the house was finally demolished, the crew refused to continue after the third day. Tools went missing, footsteps echoed when no one was there, and the air inside was colder than outside even. At noon, One worker claimed he saw a young girl standing by the tree line, hair pale as ash, eyes like glass. She didn't move. She didn't blink. Maybe it was imagination, maybe guilt, but when they cleared the debris and marked the ground for development, the county quietly rezoned the lot as unsuitable for habitation. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Because the truth isn't that monsters hide among us. It's that sometimes they build homes, raise children, and are buried in the same soil they poisoned. The Avery case was never officially closed because there was never a body. Not for Eleanor, not for Margaret, just a house full of ghosts and the remains of a man who thought he could outrun God. The townsfolk say his death was quiet. He'd grown old, frail, and alone. When they found him in his chair, his eyes were open, fixed on the window that faced the orchard where the shed once stood. He died watching the place where he'd buried everything he couldn't control. After the demolition, that land lay untouched for nearly 20 years. Grass grew in strange patterns. Dogs refused to cross the fence. One stormy night, lightning struck the site directly, igniting the dry brush, and when the fire crew arrived, they swore they saw shapes in the smoke. Two figures, standing hand in hand, watching the flames consume the last pieces of the Avery home. A historian who specialized in domestic crimes later obtained the surviving notebooks and the birth records. He pieced together what really happened, but the county refused to publish it. His conclusion was too disturbing, too raw, that Eleanor never escaped, not truly. That her disappearance wasn't flight, it was transformation. The shed, the chains, the rituals carved into the wood weren't punishment, they were preparation. In Avery's final entries, one note repeats again and again in shaky handwriting: "She must return whole." No one knew what he meant, but one line at the very end chills anyone who reads it. It says, "The child carries the blood of her mother and the heart of her brother. She will live forever if buried correctly." When ground-penetrating radar was finally used years later, they discovered a small cavity under the foundation, not a grave, more like a nest. Inside it were bones too small to identify, and a ring engraved with the initials M.A. The evidence was never released to the public, but the sheriff who witnessed it resigned the same week. His last words to the press were simple: that house wasn't haunted, it was waiting. And if you go there today, the locals say, you can still hear the faint creak of a chain on quiet nights. Not wind, not metal, just a sound that doesn't stop, even though everyone who made it is long gone. Because some bloodlines don't end, they echo. Years later, the story of Eleanor and Mr. Avery slipped from public memory. The papers stopped printing the name, the land was fenced off, and new families moved into town without ever hearing a word of what had happened there. But for those who'd been children in that era, who'd seen the house with their own eyes, forgetting was never an option. They still talk about the smell that came after it rained, a sour copper scent that rose from the ground like something trying to breathe. One man, now in his 60s, came forward in an interview. He said he used to deliver milk to the Avery house. He remembered Eleanor opening the door one morning, her hair unkempt, her eyes sunken. Behind her stood Mr. Avery, perfectly composed, one hand resting on her shoulder. "She's not well today," the man had said. "She won't be speaking anymore." After that, the boy never saw her again. As time passed, myths replaced memory. Some said the Avery bloodline had been cursed. Others claimed that Eleanor's spirit still walked the orchard, protecting anyone who dared to uncover the truth. But there were darker versions, whispers that she never died at all, that Avery's obsession with purity had worked in some terrible way. In the 1990s, when urban explorers began filming abandoned places, a small group entered what remained of the Avery property. Their footage, later confiscated by police, allegedly showed a wooden beam in the basement carved with a single phrase: "She is mine until the end." The last seconds of the tape were nothing but static, then a voice, faint, distant and unmistakably young, whispering a single word: "Father." The tape was dismissed as a hoax, but one of the explorers years later was found dead in his apartment. The only thing missing was his camera, and on his wall, scrawled in chalk, were two initials: E.W. Some say the Avery case represents the decay of an American ideal, the illusion that family is always sacred, that blood always means belonging. But others believe it's something older, something buried in the country's marrow, the quiet horror of lineage, of control, of love turned to ownership. Eleanor's story is not unique, it's just the one that refused to stay buried. They say the last generation to remember the Averys has mostly died out. Their houses stand empty now, their letters yellowed and brittle, their memories scattered across estate sales and forgotten attics. Yet, every few years, someone still stumbles upon a fragment, an old photograph, a parish ledger, a name scratched into the underside of a pew, and the same questions come back like the echo of a prayer no one finished. Who was she really? What did she know before she vanished? One photograph, discovered in 2017 in a church archive, reignited those questions. It showed Eleanor, maybe 14, standing beside a man who was not Mr. Avery. His face is mostly obscured, but the outline of his jaw and hands match no one from town records. On the back of the photo, written in faint graphite, are 3 words: "She found him." The handwriting matches Margaret's. No one knows who "him" refers to. Some say it was the real Samuel, the brother who never died, who fled and tried to take Eleanor away. Others believe it meant something else entirely, that him was the shadow Avery worshipped, the one he wrote about in his notebooks when his mind began to unravel. Because in the last pages of those journals, beneath the rambling and the prayers, he wrote about a voice, one that came to him through the walls, through Eleanor's laughter, through the silence at night. He believed the bloodline was speaking back to him, that it demanded sacrifice, that it chose its vessel. And maybe, in some twisted way, it did. When the historian who compiled all this evidence finally published his findings online, the site was taken down within days. The files vanished, the photographs disappeared from the digital archive, but people had already seen them, enough to know they weren't supposed to. What remains is a single truth that refuses to die. Eleanor's story was not an accident of cruelty. It was a design, a ritual born in secrecy, sustained by silence, and buried in the heart of an American town that pretended it never happened. And if you drive past the old county road tonight, you might still see the faint outline of a house that no longer stands, a silhouette against the moonlight, a whisper in the trees. And you'll hear it too, that small, broken voice calling from the dark, the same word she grew up saying until the very end: "Father."